This week, we speak with Gareth Rushgrove from Snyk. In the news segment, we look at vendor security for interstellar infrastructure projects, password security for your IoT garbage compactors, how to make the clearance codes for your deflector shield resistant to social engineering, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. As the world of software-driven everything becomes a reality and development cycles speed up, sales teams are taking a new approach to application security, one that enables security teams to scale by empowering developers to integrate security into their development workflows and toolsets, all while giving security teams the visibility and control they need. Snyk helps software-driven businesses develop fast and stay secure with a developer-first solution that seamlessly and proactively finds and fixes vulnerabilities in open-source libraries and containers. Learn more and see the solution for yourself at securityweekly.com/Snyk. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 106, recorded May 4th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hello, Matt.
May the 4th be with you.
There we go. Embrace it. Embrace it, Matt. We've also got John Kinsella here. Hello, John.
Hey, happy almost Cinco de Mayo.
Good to see you here. And listeners can't tell, but you've got some bookshelves behind you now. So this is good. You even have some books on them.
Slow progress. Still sort of moving things around, figure out what goes where, and we're a few more weeks, we'll get there.
Excellent. We'll keep an eye on you as the weeks grow and more books show up there. Join the Security Weekly mailing list by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and clicking the button to join the list. We will be starting to roll out our public Discord channel in the next week or so, and our mailing list subscribers will get the first invites. Learn how penetration testing reduces risk in our next live webcast with Core Security, a health systems company. Register for our upcoming webcasts or virtual trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/webcasts. You can also access our on-demand library of previously recorded webcasts and trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/on-demand. Gareth Rushgrove is a director of product at Snyk, working remotely from Cambridge, UK, helping to build interesting tools for people to better secure infrastructure and applications. He has previously worked for the UK Government Digital Service, focused on infrastructure, operations, and information security, as well as at Puppet and Docker. When not working, he can be found curating the DevOps Weekly newsletter, hiking, or reading a good book. Hello, Gareth, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having us.
It's great to have you here, and it's great to hear that you're reading some books. Maybe you could recommend some for John to throw on those empty bookshelves there. And you're also curating the DevOps Weekly newsletter. That's pretty interesting, because I think one of the things I'm curious about is how often or how does security or security topics sneak their way into DevOps?
Good question. I'll talk about that a bit through, I guess, the sort of span of that. DevOps was that word that was sort of coined 10 years ago that brought a lot of people together to talk about the topics that we talk about as DevOps now. I was lucky enough to be there really early. So I was at the second DevOps days in Hamburg. And I would say that there were maybe no just straight security people there. There were a lot of operators, a lot of developers like myself, and there were less than 100 people. But security wasn't a big topic. It was something some of those people had responsibility for. But I think as DevOps as a movement grew, you saw more specialists coming along. You saw a few security people coming along, and security became more of a topic of interest. I would say now it's a big topic of interest to the extent that you have like people talking about DevSecOps as a sort of like nearly parallel sort of group of people. But yes, I think that's grown. To start with, not that much. I think the focus was on monitoring, it was on deployment. But as that like became easier, you saw security becoming more and more interesting to, I guess, that community of people who were trying to break down silos and barriers.
So Gareth, you said something in what you just said. You said parallel, as in DevSecOps is this parallel group to DevOps. That's not how we want this to happen, though. We don't want another parallel group, right? We want Sec embedded into DevOps and integrated, not parallel.
Yeah, and maybe parallel's the wrong word. Like I chose there. And I think that like there's always risks with additional words in that, like it's like having sort of football teams. People like you've got Manchester United, Manchester City, like they both have the word Manchester in them, but like those two groups of people probably do different things and congregate in different places. So I think there are risks with additional words. The reality, though, with DevOps, and I think this bugs some people, is that, like, to me, DevOps was always about marketing, and DevSecOps is also all about marketing. And by adding the sec word in there, ultimately, it maybe gave permission to a bunch of other people to turn up to the conversation. So I don't think it has to be parallel in a bad sense. I think sometimes it's useful, especially when people point that out, like you just did. So we definitely don't want like a DevOps philosophy and a DevSecOps philosophy. I don't think it's bad that there are two words at the end of the day that bring different people to the party.
Well, you also mentioned too that when DevOps first started, it sounded like it was the developers, it was people who were building and maintaining the services that they were being deployed. And I think if I recall, you also mentioned there was a little bit more responsibility for security coming onto those teams. And I think if anything, to Matt's point, having security in parallel isn't quite the right direction or the right thought process. Even if it's something that's supportive, it's more about that the DevOps team getting more responsibility for security. And I guess, how have you seen that conversation evolve? Are security people then showing up to developers saying, oh, this is how you should be doing things, or go do it this way, and then they walk away? Or what's been more of a successful engagement, the way that security does show up and start to be part of that conversation?
I think that it's like, to me, that's about, do you buy into the idea that we're better working together? Like cutting away sort of job titles and which bit of an organization you work in. If you think like fundamentally my role is to secure the system or like deploy like applications or make sure our uptime is good or add this new feature. If you buy into, but the best way of doing that is to work with people who are not in my team, in my department, in the same role as me. I think that you naturally sort of blur those lines and go work with other people. And I think the best security people that I know have always wanted to do that. And they've been able to do that well sometimes, but also sometimes they've just been told to go away because they're from security. It's true of like good operations people as well, trying to help teams improve their deployment processes or monitoring practices, and being told to go away because you're in IT. What do you know? The moment you acknowledge that other people have expertise you don't have and they can help you, I think then you end up with like, that's when it works. You have to acknowledge that like you can't know everything, that these specializations exist. And even if you don't have the organizational structures yet, like embracing the people who cross over the boundaries, I think is how that's where it works in my view. Like that's where you see organizations reaping the benefits of some of these practices.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's not so much there is that need for specialization, but it's not so much that it is an assembly line where the code and the deployment goes from this one specialization to this other one to this other one. I think it's fair to say it's mixed, or at least it's when it's mixed, it's more successful. And what I mean by that is if the security team is showing up with tools that actually help the DevOps, rather than just saying we don't know exactly what all the nuances are and the performance characteristics of your application. But whatever you do, you have to go through this OWASP top 10 list. Get back to us when you've addressed it. It's more of, here's some ways to make sure that you have some good configuration settings, or even better, here are some ways that we enforce just a default, more secure configuration to start with, and therefore we can worry less about some small mistakes and focus more on some other security aspect of the app.
Or to put it in context. I think too much, I think security being an example where in lots of organizations, there's a very small number of quite harried security people and a lot of developers, developers internally, developers externally, developers on different time zones. And I think in that context, it obviously makes sense that the security people are just running around going like, here's the OWASP top 10, bye. I think that's where systems administrators were as well. They were just running around, putting out fires, provisioning new servers, running away again, wait until they ran out of disk, coming back, like just realistically without the time to do the strategic work. I think that's where, like, sort of the appreciation that these were, I was mentioning it today, like the idea that operations, and I think I include security in that, like was a secret source, not just a cost center. And the fact that you can automate some of those problems. So on the operations side, automating provisioning, automating monitoring, automating like just whatever you can, build the time for you to do the strategic work. You then have something like SRE, which is very much contextual. It's all about actually working with development teams around their application. Like, what are they trying to do? Why are they trying to do it? Not here's a list of 10 things you should do by. I think we're seeing that with security now as well. Like, there are like tooling, automated approaches to some aspects of security that were just the time sink.
But security had one additional problem in it, right? Maybe we weren't getting the context up front, but what was worse is then when it got to the end, they were always like, well, no, you can't do that, or no, this can't go into production, which didn't help our cause at all in this process anyway. So, the contextualization of what we're trying to help the development teams understand when it comes to application security, but also embracing and make it easier to get through the different steps so there's not this big stop sign at the end of the process is probably the other big one we have to solve.
Well, feedback, like the feedback cycle sucks at that point. Like no one is happy. It turns out the security, maybe the pathological security people was like, I have power because I said no at the end. But most of the security people actually want to work for an organization that does ship software. They want that software to be secure. Security people are great at talking about risk. Like talk about risk in like the security context. That's what it's all about. No, most of them don't really fit the stereotype of like the most secure application is one that doesn't exist. Like, no, that it's not unreasonable, but it is like without that feedback cycle in both directions. If developers are not going to actually provide feedback into security about the types of applications, the types of data, what are we trying to do? They're just going to say, oh no, just give us a list, tell us what to do. Like, you haven't told me what your application is trying to do yet. And security at the end saying no, developers are not going to be happy with that feedback cycle of nothing, no. A lot of organization design, I think, comes down to how do you design the feedback cycles for good and bad.
So when you have that moving that feedback cycle earlier, obviously, can also be a lot better. And you mentioned too the tools around like automating the deployment, a lot of the automation that can lead to an SRE. And there are some ancillary security properties that can come out of that automation, but those aren't strictly security automation. So what are some tools or automation that you've seen that are ways to bring that feedback cycle about security earlier in the development process, so we don't have to wait until it's deployed and there is a bug bounty report that sends in, here's the simple cross-site scripting, or here is, it's getting ready to deploy and the security team says it has to go through their own checklist?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, again, I'm biased that I joined Snyk maybe a year ago, partly because I saw it as one of the tools in that space. I'd worked on the software vendor side for a little while, but before that, I worked for the UK government in more of a sort of, operations development architecture role. And so I'd seen like the need for tools like that before. I'd built a bunch of things. But I think one of the properties of Snyk is ultimately it makes it very easy to integrate early in that pipeline, but also without you having to do a lot of configuration. I think that's one of the sort of points of friction for like lots of tools in general is like the adoption, the trade-off might be there. It might be like, this will be really valuable, but you'll have to do a lot of configuration. You'll have to do a lot of tweaking. You'll have to do a lot of work around it. I think tools that don't have that property are quite easy to adopt en masse. Snyk just solves one of those point problems of surfacing vulnerabilities in your third-party code. So you're using third-party software container images. You're using third-party open source libraries. Knowing that they have vulnerabilities in them, at the point that you're choosing them, at the point that you're writing your code, ultimately, again, that feedback cycle is incredibly fast.
But that's frequently not the problem. Sorry, Gareth. That's frequently not the problem, right? It's not so much that people are finding they're picking a package that has Swiss cheese. I mean, that happens some of the times. At least when I'm seeing the real important pain point is you've picked something, it looks wonderful, you've pushed out to production 6 months later while you're on a beach having your pina colada and social distancing, some new vulnerability comes out and your application is suddenly not quite what you thought it was.
Yep. Would you agree with that? Time matters there. It's definitely I guess that's one of the things with DevOps as well. It really moving the conversation from the idea that you write software and you ship it and you're done to you're not done until you actually tear that service down and it's decommissioned. And I think of the operations and security have always thought like that. Development less so. And having development tools that fit into saying it's not just about when you're writing your code, it's about you running that as well.
So that's a really interesting point. Sorry, Mike, I keep interrupting people. That's a really interesting point, but I think that's the way you just said that is something I haven't heard before. So I want to really point that out to people. You're right. If you look at, the CISSP book isn't here, but if you look at any of those type of books, they talk about the life cycle, and the final stage of that is shutdown. How many of us have actually shut down an app or a functionality or a data center, whatever have you, right? We very seldom do that. We, at least in my life, we write something, we push it out to the world, we go, hey, that's cool, and then off we go to the beach, right? Or we go off to the next project or something else, and hey, look at me. But we very seldom think about what happens at the end. And I was going to ask you, how do you deal with that? And you actually answered a question in a really interesting way. If you have a tool such as Snyk, that's constantly sitting in there testing, that allows you to take your eyes off the ball in that particular way. Would that, am I reiterating what you said?
Yeah, that's I think as well that there's loads of nuance there around those types of applications because I think in particular organizations that are adopting microservices, they're often creating a lot of services quite quickly. Mm-hmm. That even if you're working on the whole system, like all the time, you have a dedicated engineering team. That's not always the case working on a system all the time. You might not touch one of the services because it had a tightly bound context. It was just doing one thing. And it's just sat there working. And I think it's especially true in that context where there's been this explosion of services. Some of them are very small, tightly coupled, tightly scoped, which is nice from an operational standpoint. But from that security point of view, it's easy for you to go, well, no one has touched it for a while, therefore it has the same vulnerabilities as it had when we shipped it. The reality, given the huge usage of third-party libraries and the rapid discovery of vulnerabilities in them, that's not true. And I think that is something that sort of changes versus a performance problem, for example. Like if I write some code and it has certain performance characteristics, they're broadly speaking going to be true, assuming I'm running it on the same hardware. They're not going to get magically better over time or worse over time. Security gets worse over time, whether you like it or not.
Especially if you're using PHP, right?
Oh man! Well, that actually. So my ears perked up, and John dove in there on what got me interested too. Is that you're not done with an app until you decommissioned it. And my question was actually going to be: is there are also Python 2 was end of life this year in early 2020. Ruby versions keep bumping up because older versions are going out of long-term support. Matt wanted to pick on a little bit of PHP, and while some of them don't have, there's tech debt there, and tech debt doesn't always have a direct vulnerability. Here is the CVE associated with this. It's more of you're kind of out of luck if a vul never comes up because there's no commitment from the community then to provide patches for that. So my question more of is, in that idea of the feedback loops and what you were hitting on there, Gareth, about talking about decommissioning, even with microservices, have you seen tools like Snyk or this? Have you seen this type of dependency, even just version checking, change that behavior or be a different way to have a better conversation about having, decommissioning or migrating off of tech debt?
Yeah, definitely. Because I think that's it comes from visibility. I think one of the sort of tenets of DevOps, the sort of was really around being able to measure things. And again, that wasn't DevOps created that. That was people's realization that visibility into what's running is important. And you see, I think there's a renewed set of conversations around software bill of materials. Configuration management databases, in theory, were the IT solution to this, but you rarely see developers talking about configuration management databases. This idea of having a database that describes all of the component parts in your system. And very few organizations really have that mystical place, especially given the explosion of services, self-empowered teams, the rest of it. Keeping up to date there, I think the idea that you can centralize that in a database and then have a team to keep up to date ultimately failed. And that failed before we got to probably the explosion of services that we see today. Pushing that down to individual teams, and I think tools that help you push things out to the edges are the only way you can scale that.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think one of the really interesting things with Snyk is its dependency capabilities, right? And not only just immediate dependencies, we're talking transient dependencies, 4th, 5th, 6th generations down, because it's hard enough, I think, for most organizations to understand their dependencies on the open source they're consuming, let alone all the dependencies of the open source they've used that are leveraged on some other open source, and this chain continues. It's a daunting task.
And the thing is, it's moving at the speed of the rest of the internet, and especially in some ecosystems, and you can have quite quickly 1,000 dependent packages, which is amazing. Given you wonder why, as a developer, you can be so productive. The answer is because you're not writing most of the code, but you're responsible for running all of the code, and that gap is, I think, it's easy to fall into, especially as a new developer. I mean, I packages came along later from when I sort of started programming. It wasn't like you wrote everything from scratch and wrote bad code yourself. But the visibility into what you're actually running, and it's there, but it's a bit hidden from you. It's an implementation detail. It's not something you need to care about. In the same way as like if you said to someone, "Oh, what syscalls have been used by your application?" They might not know because it's at a distance. I think like having tools that surface what's actually happening, but you can't just say, "Oh, this is all the things you're running," or you can, but that's a lot of data. It's like picking out which ones are most important at any given time becomes the next sort of order challenge. Especially like you said with transitive dependencies, it's not just the things you're picking, it's the things that are coming in that someone else down that tree has chosen.
Right.
Especially with attacks on like packages themselves now.
I am curious, still sticking on this theme, but I want to come around from the people angle, because you've been talking about, for example, like an organization, they may have tons of microservices, and it gets deployed, and perhaps the team then the service is stable. The team disbands or reorganizes into go support some new service or work on some different code base. So now you have potentially some vulnerabilities or some tech debt looming in some, call it unowned code or some orphaned code, or in dependencies. How have you seen organizations be successful in tracking that? Because what we're talking about here is tools, I think very rightly, like Snyk, providing visibility, but you need to have some follow-up on there as well in order to address the problem.
Yeah, so I think it's a problem suffered in different types of organizations more than others. I think that the classic answer of how you avoid it is you never do that. You ultimately you take the sort of Jeff Bezos quote of like, you build it, you run it. Like, you're responsible for running that now, and ultimately you never have software in your organization that does not have like a development team that owns it. That's easier said in a growing like SaaS-based business, frankly. You're growing, so basically you don't suffer the idea that this person doesn't want to maintain the same software for 10 years. You've got enough growth that you can turn over teams over time. There's always new software. So yes, those things exist and they're supporting other things. S3 being a classic example from AWS territory. So I think the answer, fundamentally, the best answer is you never do that. Software is always owned by a team. The reality in maybe a more classic organization, and I think this is where I have some issues with the whole everyone is a software company, because I think that's the software company approach. If everyone's a software company, that's the answer everyone has to reach. Working with some government departments or working with large organizations, that's not always going to be the case. They're often they have to make these trade-offs. They don't have frankly, the revenue of a classic software company to justify a big enough software staff. And so can you outsource these things? Is one question. The dreaded maintenance team, I've seen that not work, but I believe it would be possible. But how is a different question. Outsourcing comes with its own perils as well. I think that's where standardization of tooling becomes useful, because if you can you take your bespoke application with its bespoke framework and its bespoke tooling and give it to someone else to run for you? Probably not, or not without great cost. So I think it's a very difficult problem unless you can answer it with you just don't do it. I think that's where organizations are being asked to build up that software capability, but that's not cheap in my experience.
Yeah, definitely a complex problem. It's always hard to say just don't do this, because just as engineering, there's always a trade-off. There's always, here are your three choices, pick two. I'm curious too, kind of maybe along that theme of just ways that you've seen organizations adapt or use this visibility to their advantage. Are there ways that you've seen particularly like other gotchas in package management, or the other types of problems that an overdependence on packages introduces, perhaps? More so than just vulnerabilities or being out of date. And I guess I'm a little bit in my mind, I'm thinking of the provenance of packages, of course, but also too then just packages. Here is the two-line piece of functionality that is wrapped in a 200-line package with its own dependency tree.
And there's a complexity bargain you make by using third-party code, and I think there's sometimes, well, I think like different ecosystems vary differently there as well. So you look at the JavaScript ecosystem, for example, and it's an incredibly rich set of third-party packages and some incredible software there, but also a very, very long tail of, like you say, some that are purely syntactic sugar that is makes a slightly nicer API with a one-line change. Good example of this that actually led to a wide-scale security vulnerability recently was the zip slip issue. So this was a vulnerability actually discovered by some of the security researchers at Snyk, and then published like with a load of open source maintainers. And ultimately, it was present in a load of different ecosystems. It was basically a vulnerability in how people were decompressing zip files, tar files. But the issue in the open source community was fundamentally that in Java, like the Java libraries for doing the file compression had an ugly API. Someone wrote a nice library to give it a nice API, and everyone used that because it had a nicer API. And that vulnerability was present in that library. And suddenly you have these sort of like nearly aesthetic reasons that people will choose higher level libraries that lead to potential widespread vulnerabilities. I think there's benefit in those sometimes small packages, but you bear a complexity cost. Not just a complexity cost, actually, compliance, licenses. I've done license audits, for example, for due diligence for companies previously. And obviously, at one point, that would have been like the law hasn't really changed here. The lawyers haven't changed here. The lawyers are still saying, okay, tell me what software you're running. And at one point, 15 years ago, that would have been, oh, okay, I'll go find out what software I'm running. Today, in a 200-person organization that's been using open source and building software for a while, it's orders of magnitude more software that they will be using. And do you have the licenses for all that? Do you understand the license interactions with all of that? It's just a lot more complex.
Yeah. Did you give up all of your intellectual property rights because you chose the wrong library?
Yeah. It's all of that sort of like the interactions of it's not just the individual discrete packages. And I think that's the thing that at the point of choice, you're probably choosing one thing. I mean, that thing might bring some transitive dependencies. You might be choosing React and it brings a load of the internet with it. Or you might be choosing an individual package from PyPy or whatever, or Ruby Gems, to solve an individual problem. At that moment, it makes perfect sense. But are you is someone else in your organization choosing a library that ultimately does the same thing in a slightly different way that's not really meaningful, but now your organization is using two things? I think there's that sort of like open source optimizes for that individual, or optimizes for anyone basically being able to like go faster by relying on software written by others. But I don't think we've really seen the tools for using that at scale in as an efficient way as you might see someone with a very centralized process. Google's an interesting model. They took this sort of monorepo approach, and they will generally say, we run one version of a bit of software. So they'll run one version of OpenSSL. And yes, the reality is slightly different. But that's broadly speaking how they deal with it. They have one single source tree, and you're using the same thing. Like there is a single solution to a problem. Like that sort of freedom and centralization, I think you see time and time again. Like how do you, especially imposing on an existing organization, especially given organization like big companies are often actually lots of separate business units. You've got all these sort of, do you optimize for centralization? Do you optimize for pushing things out to the edges? Questions. And the packages are definitely just one of the symptoms, one of the sort of properties there. Self-empowered development teams versus specialized teams, microservices versus monoliths, sort of event passing versus enterprise service buses. But all these things are sort of centralization and decentralizing sort of like aspects.
I think, and those are all great examples of what the DevOps teams are choosing as design patterns or sort of their call them culture or organizational patterns. And security just has to adapt because monorepos versus microservices, as you're pointing out, they definitely have different properties. And I think it would be an impossible mission for a security team to come and try to say, no, we don't like the monorepo because it's going to, or say we want to force everyone into a monorepo so we can have everyone on one specific version of OpenSSL so it's easier to audit. The business product teams, maybe they can move in that direction, but they'll move that direction for for engineering reasons. They're not going to move that direction for security reasons.
Yeah, I think that like one aspect of that I think is like traditionally security was very much a centralizing like sort of function, and the current sort of climate I guess we find ourselves in is probably like quite decentralized or trying to be quite decentralized. I think that will swing back as well. But I think like thinking about security problems in terms of how does this work in a decentralized world is a good sort of thought experiment for whatever specific security problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think part of working in whether centralized or decentralized, perhaps more so when you're decentralized, it's always good to keep up on the events of DevOps with a DevOps Weekly newsletter, perhaps. Gareth, as we wrap up here, I'm curious, is there anything that you want to tease about in maybe an upcoming topic that you'll be writing about or something else within in the DevOps world?
Yeah, I guess like one of the topics that we haven't touched on too much here, but I think definitely overlaps is like, and organizations have been adopting open source for a long time, and we touched a little bit on sort of the adoption of containers. I think one of the things that's going on hand in hand with that sort of decentralization is just how much configuration developers are writing today. Configuration management was definitely another one of those areas, a bit like ops and security, buried somewhere in IT. It feels like that's like we're decentralizing the management of configuration at the moment. So developers are writing Docker files and Kubernetes configuration files and Terraform code and serverless configs nearly as much as that, like they're writing their application code. So I think that's an area of like interest to me from a security standpoint, and we'll been doing a bunch of writing on at the moment.
That's cool. Yeah, I can definitely see how that would bring a new hope to developers to have that configuration be more secure by default, in addition to the third-party security dependency checking that we've been talking about here. And I want to thank you for both of those topics and a great discussion, Gareth. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, good to chat. Thank you for having us.
And I also want to thank my co-hosts, Matt and John. Thank you, guys. We are going to take a quick break, and then we're going to return with news of the week.